Hello students, I'm going to record this video and assume that we're going to have school at some point and you might get to talk to me about it. So we're going to talk about responding to climate change, which is the last third of the unit on climate change. And some of this stuff is old and some of it is new, but I'm just going to go over all of it because I didn't make multiple PowerPoints for this. So vulnerability, who is vulnerable to climate change? I think in a lot of ways we've seen in class that it is marginalized societies. It's people who are poor, people who are uneducated, people from a low power group, be they female or a certain gender or a certain religion. Those groups are more at risk to climate change than people who are wealthy or can easily move or can easily adapt to climate change. So the case studies that we use for this were the ones that we prepared for the climate justice silent debate and for your letter to the UN. I gave you one HIC and one LIC so that you could get a sense for how climate change was affecting both countries. So the idea for IB is that you're going to come to the table with two case studies of countries that have different risk levels. So with the HICs, they're usually able to handle adapting financially. Like they still have the problems that come with climate change, like Louisiana in the United States flooded, Houston flooded. People might be losing out on crops or be having trouble getting water in the Midwest. But generally we can adapt and fix those problems or try to fix those problems. And so we perceive climate change as like this thing that, yeah, we should work on it. Yeah, it's a problem. Let's think about what we might do. In low-income countries, it just happens that a lot of these countries are in more dangerous physical places and they have less money to adapt. So a country like Bangladesh, for example, is in a flood-prone area already, that they are at sea level mostly, and so when a typhoon comes by, then, which is a hurricane in the Pacific, then they're really at risk for flooding. Other countries like Somalia, they're surrounded by ocean, but they're also in the Sahel, which is a very dry place in Africa. So these countries are in physically demanding places, and they can't adapt as well as rich countries have. And that whole climate justice thing comes in again. Like they didn't really create the problem, but they're the ones living with it, and they have a very they're very aware that climate change is a problem. So we also talked in class about geopolitical attempts at mitigating climate change, which is a fancy way for saying how have countries regulated themselves or how they come together to make agreements. And although we have had many meetings about climate change, the actual success rate is pretty low for geopolitical attempts. HICs have promised to lower their greenhouse gas emissions, for example, at Kyoto and at Paris, but we haven't really seen them following suit. Or following what they're actually saying that they're going to do. And now developing countries are agreeing to things, but it's not clear if they're going to follow the prescriptions, since a lot of developed countries aren't either. So here's some of the examples. We took notes on this in class, so if you have that sheet and you have this somewhere, then that's good. If not, here are the kind of big three. Kyoto, where they created these goals just for developed countries. The US refused to ratify it, so they weren't involved, and so it failed. Copenhagen, where they said, yeah, we'll agree on something at some point to keep warming below 2. And then Paris in 2015 has been the best chance thus far. This is where all countries decide to come up with their own way of lowering greenhouse gases, which is GHGs. I'm just going to use that from now on because I don't feel like writing out greenhouse gases. And it gave money to LICs to adapt to climate change. It's going to be revisited every 5 years. The hope by some is that it's going to get stronger every 5 years. We talked about in class how some people think that maybe it's too weak and it's never going to get strong enough to actually do what they wanted it to do. Just so you know, there was a practice question on this stuff on the one practice exam that IB gave you. Let me show you that. So here we go. They asked, state and explain one geopolitical attempt to reduce the challenges posed by global climate change. So you have to actually name what meeting, what agreement you want to talk about, and then explain how it was an attempt to try to make climate change not so bad. So just to let you know, like, these are the kinds of questions that they're looking at asking you. So they could go from geopolitical and instead ask about technological or economic. They could ask about companies or NGOs, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So carbon offsetting, you also watched a little video on this. It's basically the same as cap and trade. This seems to be the favored approach that is thrown out there, is either taxing carbon or allowing companies or countries to buy credits if they can't stop polluting, and encourage companies to cut back, countries to cut back their pollution. The hope is that if these carbon credits are expensive enough, that companies will decide it's financially better for them to cut back emissions rather than have to buy these credits. Now, there's been some evidence that some countries or companies have kind of gamed the system where they make it seem like they polluted more in the past so that they can get more credits. There also has been a lot of volatility in the market, so sometimes the credits are a lot cheaper than they need to be to force countries to change. So carbon offsetting, it's a good idea, but in practice, like, it hasn't worked out all the time. But it's still one of the better ideas we have, is to create an economic incentive. Other than the Paris Agreement, there are also other ways for countries to get money, to get help. These are UN, World Bank, Chinese investment opportunities, so that countries can fix some of the things they're doing and mitigate climate change. So one of the ones I thought was most interesting is this UN RED. Anytime you see UN before an acronym, it means it's the United Nations. So they work with countries to try to create sustainable forests. And if you took deforestation and made it a country, it would be the third highest polluter after the United States and China. So deforestation is a gigantic problem. And it's also reforestation or afforestation, like replanting forests, would be one of the easiest things that we could do to combat climate change, because we know how to do it already. It's a natural thing. You just plant trees. You don't have to create some huge new technology. So they're working with 65 partner countries to try to help them save their forests. There's other money out there for projects. The World Bank, which makes it sound like every country is involved, but it's really like the US is mostly the one that funds the World Bank. They give money for development projects and give a lot of expertise to make them sustainable. China has started this new Belt and Road Initiative that we'll probably talk about a lot in the next unit. They also offer money to countries to build infrastructure. And so it's just a way for countries to get help to mitigate climate change. So we talked about economics. This is a little bit of the science-y part. Geoengineering is when you try to re-engineer the planet to slow down climate change. And it can be as extreme as that sounds. Large-scale engineering of the world sounds like it's the plot to a James Bond movie or something. But some of these technologies are done already, like carbon capture and sequestration, means to capture carbon out of the air and bury it underground, or to capture carbon before it even gets out of the factory and bury it underground. That has been done already. Ocean fertilization has been tried. There's some issues with that and algae blooms and things. But there are also ones that are kind of futuristic. And the goal of geoengineering is to try to to take out more carbon dioxide than we put into the atmosphere. So then it would be net neutral or a net negative if things go extremely well. So we're trying to lower how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. Unfortunately, right now, CO2 continues to rise. So this is kind of down the road. So here's a picture of carbon capture and storage. So, the manufacturing plant creates CO2, and instead of it going into the air, it is sent through these pipelines and stored in some sort of underground natural formation. So this can look different depending on the geology and stuff, but that's the basics. What's positive about geoengineering? It would be great if we didn't have a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there might be new technology that makes this easier and easier, especially for companies. And companies are a huge player in carbon dioxide creation. Even though it's good for us to cut back, households only account for about 10% of CO2 emissions in the US. So we really need companies to do their job and protect the environment as well. So maybe new tech will help them do that. The negatives of geoengineering: it is really expensive. It is so expensive. So that is a huge barrier, especially for low-income countries. Some of the ideas out there involve manipulating the earth in quite a large way, like changing the world's oceans or putting panels or mirrors or to block out part of the sun in the atmosphere, or the change cloud cover on a worldwide level. So we don't really know what effect that will have. So this is all theoretical. So once we do it, we might find out that we like seeing the sun every once in a while. Maybe we don't want the world to be filled with clouds every day. The other big problem, which is kind of the most depressing one, is that we might be too far along for this to work. So for example, the carbon capture sounds awesome. Let's stop it from getting into the atmosphere. Well, we would have to capture and then bury tens of billions of tons of carbon per year if we are going to become net neutral. So tens of billions of tons is quite a lot. So we need to mitigate, we need to cut down on CO2, even if we think that I can't say that word. I'm going to say carbon capture and storage, just a lot easier. If it's going to work, we have to cut down on CO2 as well. So how do you convince these companies and these countries to cut back on CO2? You get the civil society involved. Civil society meaning like citizens, people. So one group that can do this is an NGO, a non-governmental organization. These organizations run the gamut of all the different things that they might do. But it's basically any group that's nonprofit and works outside of a government control to try to fix some social or political issue. So they try to raise money from people, from grassroots work, and then try to work with companies or people or countries to try to get them to change what they're doing. So there's lots of different examples of NGOs that work on climate change. So there are some groups that do advocacy that try to convince you that it's a big problem and that you should care about it and you should do something about it. So one example is the World Wildlife Fund. They're famous for their little panda pictures and polar bear stuff. So they try to tell you hey, you're killing very cute animals, stop. Other groups try to work with corporations. We're going to talk about this group in class, Ceres. So they convince companies that they should become sustainable and help them do so. Mobilization, trying to get people involved and protesting and fighting for change. Greenpeace is one example of an organization that does that. they're kind of infamous for doing that. There are even some groups that go really far and are kind of seen as domestic terrorism groups, like the Earth Liberation Front, which sounds very terroristy. There's also support groups that will give help for programs that are started in countries, or they'll address a need that they see, and they have the expertise and money to do so. So the example we'll look at in class is the Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security NGO, which works in India to try to help them grow food in a warming world. So NGOs are a great help, and it's a great place for you to give money or to give your time or maybe even to work one day, so that you can make a positive change in the world. But companies also could be a source of help with climate change. There are a lot of companies that see a benefit in going green. They want a good public image. They want to convince people that are very talented or that are passionate about this stuff to work for them. They also see cost savings, like, for example, telecommuting or conference calling instead of traveling around the world can cut travel costs, which cuts CO2 creation. Some companies have been on the forefront of this, like Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's. There are companies like big tech companies like Google and Apple that have promised to go 100% renewable energy soon. But there are a lot of companies that might not be as sincere about this. And like I said, the world is, a lot of the world's pollution comes from companies, especially energy companies, oil companies. So although there are some companies that do good, like companies are for-profit organizations, so sometimes they're not doing what's best for the planet. So when we get to class, our last big lesson will be on how NGOs are helping some countries like Bangladesh, Zanzibar, India, and the US. And so you'll get to pick one of those countries to further explore. And then we'll have one climate simulation before we see our test. All right, I hope this wasn't too much and too much text. As always, think of questions you might have, and I'll see you in class.